Hello everyone, my name is Leightta Sherrill, and for my Keystone, I wanted to study the ways in which our sex education impacts our socialization and prepares us to engage with relationships with each other. I'd like to thank my advisor, Dr. Sarah Miller. She's the Director of Undergraduate Studies in the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program and a professor of sociology, and she's been a wonderful mentor and guide throughout this process. Before I continue, I'd also like to provide a trigger warning for mentions of sexual violence, and I encourage you to take the space that you need at any time. Planned Parenthood defines sex education as, quote, high-quality teaching and learning about a broad variety of topics related to sex and sexuality. It helps people gain the skills that are needed to navigate relationships with self, partners, community, and manage one's own sexual health. Great! So from our sex ed, we should have gained all of these skills and been prepared to begin healthy, happy sexual relationships. Except that most schools don't actually meet this standard of high-quality education, and this is largely due to the varying legislation on what can be taught in sex education spaces. In Massachusetts, for example, comprehensive sex education is both legal and recommended, but sex education is not mandatory. And if it is taught, there are only two rules. You must teach about abstinence, and you must teach about HIV and AIDS. And in my home state of Georgia, the rules are largely similar. Sex education is required, but the law requires that all teachings must adhere to the standard of teaching abstinence as a personal goal and a virtue. We're also required to learn about sexual assault and abuse awareness and prevention training, but I honestly don't remember receiving this, so I don't know how strictly they adhere to that specific rule. As you can see in the figure, states like Georgia that place a greater emphasis on abstinence tend to have higher rates of teen pregnancy and birth. Other studies have shown that students who receive only abstinence education typically have higher rates of STI transmission and have sex at an earlier age. The studies show that comprehensive sex education is better in educating people about safely exploring their sexualities, but even those who receive the most comprehensive sex education still report that their experience could have been better. And this brings us to my work. For my study, I distributed a survey among BU students asking them about their experiences with sex education, how it impacted their intimate relationships, and how it could have better prepared them to feel comfortable and confident with their sexualities. I should note that I was not specifically targeting those who received abstinence education, but any kind of sex education. Let's look at the results. In the top right, you can see some of the topics that were covered in my participants' sex education. The number one topic covered was STIs, though far fewer people were taught about what to do in the event of contracting an STI. Additionally, many people were taught about contraceptives, but fewer people were taught about consent. Clearly, a program that teaches about contraception is not entirely based in abstinence, and if you can teach about condoms, you can teach about communication. On the bottom left, you can see that none of my participants felt that their sex education was inclusive of diverse genders, sexes, and sexualities. Although almost 2/3 of my participants identified as queer, none of them felt that their sex education was an adequate reflection of queer identities, and when asked how they would improve their sex ed, one of the most common answers was including relevant information about queer identities. In the graph on the left, you can see that most participants did not feel comfortable asking questions to their sex education teachers. They reported a number of reasons, including their teacher's aggression or indifference and a fear of being judged by their classmates. On the right, you can see that over 2/3 of the participants learned something unhelpful in their sex education. This included learning how to put condoms on bananas and putting tape on your arm and ripping it off to show how the more sex partners you have, the more impure you allegedly become. Another participant talked about a poster that they had in their classroom, including 101 reasons to remain abstinent, including that you won't have to shave your legs. And although these are funny stories, they do get to the core of shame and humiliation that students are forced to endure in their sex ed and point to some of the reasons why they may feel discomfort confiding in their teachers. These questions were aimed at understanding how students filled the gaps left by their sex education. On the left, you can see that none of my participants felt that school was the most influential in their early understandings of sex and sexuality, Most said that it was the media and their peers, but they noted later that these were also unreliable sources. But it's not up to the media, and it's certainly not up to other teenagers to teach you about sex education. The classroom should be the most useful and unbiased and clinically factual source of sex education, in my opinion. Finally, I asked my participants what they feel it means to be ready to have sex. I put some of their overlapping words and topics into a word cloud, and I'd like to break down some of that with you. Number one was the idea of understanding. This means understanding the mechanics of sex, but also understanding your needs, your partner or partner's needs, and what it means to become sexually active. Next, we have the idea of safety and protection. This covers both physical safety and emotional safety, which ties in with the ideas of consent and communication. Finally, although it was talked about less, I appreciated that people brought up the idea of pleasure and enthusiasm, because in my opinion, being able to have sex and being ready to it means that you have all these foundations of communication, of comfort, and you can engage enthusiastically and experience this pleasure that is supposed to come. I have 3 solutions for improving the state of sex education in America. Number one, I think we need to rework sex education curriculum to reflect the themes that we've discussed today. We need to remove the idea of sex as a moral decision and promote agency among young people. Next, we need to improve the training of sex education teachers and be more selective in who is given the opportunity to share such relevant and important information in people's lives. Finally, we need to lobby for comprehensive sex education in all schools. Reworked curriculum is only as valuable as its implementation across the education system, and I believe that if we are able to achieve comprehensive sex education in all schools, we will see a new generation of people who feel greater agency in their sexualities and are better equipped to form healthy and meaningful relationships. Thank you.
Okay, if anyone has any questions, please raise your hand.
Sorry, she was really close to the microphone.
Thank you so much, Leightta. I am wondering what the most surprising thing you found was.
Ooh, I think the number of people who said that their sex education was not at all reflective of diverse genders and sexualities. I was expecting Massachusetts and California to be a little better about them, but not according to my data.
Any other questions?
I get it. This is a fantastic project. Thanks so much for the way you presented it. I had 2 questions. One was just clarificatory, and that was perhaps the slide before this one, or maybe 2 slides ahead. Yeah. So this pie chart with the media, which does seem to be where most people would seem to be the most influential source for most people. I'm interested in that because typically research tends to put that onto pornography and doesn't really break it down in terms of media, doesn't really distinguish that from pornography. What would you say were some of the responses within this? Is it television? Is it TV shows? Is it film?
Yeah.
Other forms of media?
Yes, thank you so much. It was covering television and books and everything that was not specifically pornography. I wanted to include that separately because I think they have their own positives and negatives, for a lack of a better term. I think they're both unrealistic in their expectations and their standards of the reality of sexual encounters. But for people who learned specifically from pornography, I think that it is just more explicit, but also kind of equally as inaccurate. And so I wanted to ask people kind of what the nuances were in that situation.
That's great, thank you. And my second question was just more broadly based on your research. What do you see this research contributing to in terms of conversations on campus about sex and sexuality and sex education? Thank you.
Yeah, so I was hoping to kind of fill in the gaps, because there's a lot of understanding about abstinence education not working. You knew that before you came in here. And I think a lot of the research revolves around like STI transmission, early pregnancy, earlier first encounters of sexuality, but my research talks about more of the emotional and mental impact on people. I had a lot of people report. Another question that I asked was, how did you feel leading up to your first sexual encounter versus how did you feel after it? And a lot of people had a false sense of readiness that they later understood, okay, I was not as well prepared as I could have been, and this is because I had a lot of misconceptions based on what I've seen in the media, what I've seen in pornography, and what I was not taught in the classroom. Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, thanks so much. I was wondering with the schools if you looked at public versus private and if you saw any significant differences.
I did. I looked at public versus private schools, and I did not do a statistical analysis because my sample size wasn't big enough, so I can't necessarily speak to significance. I will say that people who received private education sometimes did receive better sex ed, except for those who received religious private education. And that's especially true for like me, for example. I went to private school, and so I was able to receive non-abstinence ed because we were not forced to adhere to public school laws. But overall, there's good and bad things that can come from a school creating its own curriculum.
Okay, I have time for one more question.
Thank you. Thanks so much. So I'm wondering how you account for the frailty of human memory, in that you're talking about what people remember about their sex education, not necessarily what their sex education actually was, especially considering people tend to remember negative experiences with more clarity than positive experiences or things that scare them. So how did you account for that, and how might that shape the conclusions that you draw about the reality of sex ed?
Yeah, that was absolutely a real problem. Even I don't remember everything that I learned in my sex ed. I think it is ultimately an educator's job to provide memorable experiences, and what you teach is only as valuable as what people are able to retain. And people being able to draw back and remember what they learned, whether or not it was more or less than what they were taught, is still ultimately the value that comes from sex education. And so I think that even if programs are more inclusive than my participants are identifying, it still can provide value, and that teachers need to rethink the way that they are getting this information across to students.
Thank you, Leightta.
Thank you.